Hello and welcome to the Legacy Crusaders YouTube channel, and welcome to part 2 of the comprehensive Infernoid guide, where we're going to talk about the Void, Spell, and Trap cards. Those are the in-archetype support cards for the Infernoid archetype. So we're going to start by going through the cards in order of usefulness, so we will get to some Freddy cards as we go. And because in the previous episode I mostly went over what the monsters did, I couldn't really get into a lot of strategy-related things. I will go over some strategy-related things in this part. I will get into most of the strategy involving the Infernoid deck in the next episode. So the first card up is Void Vanishment. This is the search card for all of the other Void spells and traps. It is a continuous spell card. Once per turn, you can discard one card and add a Void spell or trap card from your deck to your hand, except another copy of Void Vanishment. So if you activate the effect of Void Vanishment to search another Void spell or trap card, and the effect resolves, you are locked into Infernoid monsters for the remainder of the turn. You cannot normal or special summon Infernoids. But something that's kind of cool is you are allowed to flip summon non-Infernoids, and you are allowed to sets. So there is a version of the Infernoid deck that plays Subterror, so if you were to trigger the effect of Void Vanishment while you have like a Subterror monster set, you can perform a flip summon. You can only use the search effect of Void Vanishment once per turn, so if your opponent were to negate it, if Void Vanishment resolves without effect, you can still summon non-Infernoid monsters. One of the things you can do is you can place it onto the field, activate the effect of Void Vanishment, chain Void Feast, sending the Void Vanishment to the graveyard as cost to resolve Void Feast. Because it's a continuous spell, if it leaves the field, it'll resolve without effect, but you'll be able to resolve Void Feast. So you might trick your opponent into ashing Void Vanishment. If they ash it, by the way, you can still summon non-Infernoids, but you can also activate Vanishment. Maybe the playline changes, and for some reason you decide you need to be able to make non-Infernoids. You can chain Void Feast to send the Void Vanishment to the graveyard, or you could negate the effect of Void Vanishment by tributing a monster you control to negate the activation or the effect with an Oku. Or you can maybe chain Forbidden Droplet to get the Vanishment off the field so that you can not resolve the effect purposely, so that you can not lock yourself into Infernoid. Just something strategic that was worth mentioning. This is recorded after the fact. You can attempt to use it again because it specifically says use. So that is a hard once per turn. It has another effect, which is that if an Infernoid monster would battle a monster your opponent controls after damage calculation, which means the monsters may or may not have survived the battle, you can still send this card from the field to the graveyard to banish both of those monsters. So sending this card from the field to the graveyard is a cost, so you can't activate it under things like Macrocosmos or Master of Dark Law, Virtual World Shen Shen. So Shen Shen is a real pain for this particular card, but this is our best card. And generally, if you're playing Void Vanishment, you're using it to search Void Feast going first. And Void Feast is the trap card I mentioned in the previous episode. It allows you to summon 3 Infernoids from your deck, ignoring their summoning condition as long as their total level is 8. The cost for using this card is to send a face-up Void spell or trap card from your hand, well, face-up on the field or from your hand to the graveyard. So normally what happens is you would activate your Void Vanishment on your first turn of the game, activate the effect, discarding generally a monster, because you can usually get some value out of them by banishing them to summon other Infernoids, and then add from your deck to your hand a copy of Void Feast. You would then set Void Feast and pass turn to your opponent. During your opponent's turn, you might want to do this in the draw phase or the standby phase, play around something like Triple Tactics Talents, but you can activate Void Feast, sending from your field to the graveyard the copy of Void Vanishment. Now, if you know you're up against a matchup where your opponent doesn't go into the extra deck, your Void Imagination becomes a bit of a dead card, so if you happen to have one of these in your hand, you might actually want to keep your Void Vanishment and send your Imagination to grave instead. One of the other cool things you can do is that if you have 2 Void Feasts, you can actually maybe search one and set one, so you could set both. Activate the Void Feast, sending the Void Vanishment to grave as cost, and then you can chain the Void Feast, sending the other Void Feast to grave as cost. So it is possible to activate multiple Void Feast using the already face-up Void cards as cost. It doesn't need to be another copy of Void Feast. You can use Voidseer, or believe it or not, the draw card into the Void is part of the Infernoid archetype. So if you activate into the Void, you can chain Void Feast and then summon your 3 Infernoids. Now you don't have to summon 3, you can summon up to 3. So here are the combinations of Infernoids you can summon, just because some people can't math. So just to be safe, the maximum value you go for when you're activating Void Feast, you resolve it, is to summon the level 6 Sajet and 2 Decatrons. Now the reason that Decatrons give you the most value is because when they're summoned, they send another Infernoid from deck to grave. Usually people send 1 Deviati and 1 Anunku. That is a monster negate, a spell and trap negate, and then your Sajet is still a DD Crow. So if your opponent activates a monster effect, you contribute a monster. negate the activation if you do banish the card. You can technically negate your own cards if you have to. Sajet, contribute a monster you control, target a card in the graveyard and banish it. And the other Decatron, which becomes Inoku, you contribute a monster you control to negate the activation or the effect of a spell or trap card and banish that card. So all these things are options for what to do. You don't have to send the negates. You could just send any other Infernoid you want access to. One of the things you can do purposely is you can try to activate the Void Feast on your turn, so you can make link plays with the monsters. Maybe you'll send the popper cards like the Petrula and the Harmodic, so you can pop cards on the field before linking them off. Because making these negates is more just to prevent your opponent from killing you. So if you go first and you go into Void Feast for a turn 1 setup, generally you go. Now, for some reason, if you draw this jet, usually you have to find a alternative play line. So the second best option for resolving your Void Feast is to summon a Rula and a Harmodic, because if you do it with Sajet and 2 Decatrons, you get 5 Infernoids of value. If you do it this way, you get 4. So you get these 2, and then Decatron sends something. Now, in this case, Decatron almost always has to send the big Infernoid you want to use, because you want to get your big Infernoids into play so that your little ones can become fuel. Because again, the little ones can only be summoned from the hand, whereas the big ones can be summoned from your hand or your graveyard. The next most likely combination you would actually play is Sightsmoss and Decatron. This usually happens if you actually resolve 2 Void Feasts. You'll summon these here, and then you'll summon Sajet, Decatron, Decatron into the other zone. You can do other combinations if you want to. One of the things you might want to do is, if you're like in a Mystic Mind matchup and your opponent goes to their end phase, sometimes I'll activate Void Feast and summon 2 Petrulas. That's 2 level 4s, and what'll happen is they'll activate like Demise of the Land or Metaverse to try and play Mystic Mind onto the field. And you can chain their quick effect to tribute themselves to target a card in their graveyard, like a draw card, and banish them. That way you have no monsters, and then Mystic Mind can destroy itself in the end. A reason why you might summon just small noids, so that you can trigger the effects to tribute themselves. But maybe you want to get the Sightsmoss in play, you might want to summon the level 1 of Permeus. More combos and specific things you can do with 1 Void Feast will be discussed in the next episode, specifically on strategy. But for now, let's get back into the actual cards and what they do. So I mentioned this ridiculously broken fusion spell in the previous episode. This is Void Imagination. You can search this off of the Void Vanishment, but then you're locked into Infernoids. Now, it is possible to OTK your opponent under the restriction of Void Vanishment, but this card is preferable to just hard draw by itself. If you open 2 of them, it's pretty easy to OTK your opponent using a OTK I will describe right now. But Void Imagination says when this card is played, it's a continuous spell card. When you activate it, it does 2 things. Firstly, all the Infernoids whose level isn't normally 1, meaning every Infernoid that isn't a Decatron and isn't a Permeus becomes level 1. So that allows you to activate this card and reduce the level limit, and then summon all your other Infernoids. They all become level 1 the moment they hit the board, except for Decatrons, and Permeus is already level 1, so it doesn't need to become level 1. It's kind of funny, if you have like a Tiara on the field, you can activate this to make Tiara level 1, and now it can attack into something like Crystal Wing, because Crystal Wing gains an attack boost when it battles a level 5 or higher monster, so you can make like Tiara level 1, and then it can attack into it. So in addition to making the levels of the Infernoids on the field level 1, which removes the level lock unless you have a Decatron that happens to be an Inoku at the time, in which case you have a level 11 effect monster on the field. The other thing it does is all the Infernoids, so all the monsters that are affected by this, so all your higher level Infernoids, will only inflict half damage while this card is face up on the field. So this is one of those scenarios where you might want to summon like 4 big Infernoids, then 1 Petrula, and then just activate Petrula to destroy this card. Because if you destroy it, it can do full damage with all the Infernoids, but the Petrula then can't attack that turn. Now, the real reason we play it is this is our fusion spell card. So when you activate this card, it doesn't do a fusion summon. But because of that, it means it can't be responded to with Solemn Warning, which is something kind of cool because it doesn't summon on activation. You can send this card from the field to the graveyard to fusion summon using cards in your hand and field. Now, if your opponent controls a monster summon from the extra deck and you do not, and you don't really make them before using the fusion card anyway, you can fuse using up to 6 material from your deck. So generally this is a going second deck, and you try to resolve Imagination and just OTK your opponent by sending this card from your field to the graveyard while they control an extra deck monster after baiting negates with all kinds of cards you might play in your deck. I'll just give you a little visual demonstration of how that works. We will imagine our opponent has a, Salamangreat Almirage on something small and useless. So we'll fusion summon, sending 6 guys to our graveyard from our deck. We'll send, this is our fusion monster. He's going to come out. I usually put him in the extra monster zone. We're going to send 1 Inoku, 1 Deviati, and then a bunch of small Infernoids. So what you want to do, and what I would recommend you do, is you activate a second Imagination, and then that reduces him to level 1, and then summon Tondel by banishing 2 of these guys. You can summon Deviati by banishing 2 of these. Usually you'll send another Infernoid with the first fusion spell because of a Tiara's effect. So you'll be able to summon all of these, and then you can activate a Tondel to tribute off the first Tiara, to banish a card in their graveyard, and now they still control their extra deck monster. And then fusion summon again, and then send the material from the deck to the graveyard a second time, summoning Tierra. So now you don't control the continuous spell, so now you do full damage, and you have 3 monsters whose total attack points are over 8,000. So in the Tierra, every time it's summoned, can send 3 cards from the extra deck to the graveyard, so you can keep sending things like Elder Entity Natess and popping your opponent's cards. This is one of the only ways to do 8,000 damage on board while you're under the restriction of Void Banishment. So often your opponent will let you resolve Banishment to lock you into Infernoid. So if you fuse once, then you can just discard a card, search the other fusion spell, do this play, and fuse again, and you can OTK your opponent while you're locked into Infernoid. Otherwise, it's very difficult to do that. The only other way to like OTK your opponent if you're locked into Infernoids is you can summon 2 Infernoids, and then if you actually play like Monster Reborn, Tierra is actually a target for Monster Reborn, and you can just Reborn Tierra and then attack for a game this way. So there are some ways to go for a game while you're locked into the restriction of Void Banishment. Next, recently got a new card, which is called Void Apocalypse. This card is just a really bad version of Void Imagination, but it has some nice features. It is a continuous spell. When you activate it, nothing happens, similar to Void Banishment. Once per turn, you can discard a card, any card, and send any fiend from your deck to the graveyard. Do note that doesn't say Infernoid. Now, if you want, you can send an Infernoid. Nothing wrong with that. But this card is kind of better in like BA Infernoid decks if you want to like normal a BA and then send a Graph, and then Graph can summon something from the deck and then make Dante or whatever you want to do there. So that's usually what it's used for. But relevant to the newer formats that are coming up, every once in a while a token archetype comes into play. And one of the things you can do to deal with tokens is send Token Collector, because it's a fiend. That's how you get value out of Void Apocalypse. Send other fiends from your deck to the graveyard, whether it be Burning Abyss monsters, Fiendish Rhino Warrior, relevant cards like Token Collector. This card's value will be changing over time based on what the best fiends are available to send to the graveyard. But it does have a secondary effect, which is if your opponent controls multiple a monster summon from the extra deck, you can send this card from the field to the graveyard as a cost, similar to the fusion spell, to send Infernoids with different names from your deck to the graveyard. So if your opponent has a full board of 6 monsters summoned from the extra deck, the maximum number of Infernoids you can send is 6, which is worse than Imagination automatically. So there's no logical reason to play Void Apocalypse over Void Imagination, because if you can resolve Imagination, you're better off resolving Imagination than you are Apocalypse. Now, in the scenario that you're trying to play a going first build, Apocalypse is at least a way to like send something like Skarm and like search a tour guide, or send a Absolute King Backjack, which is a way to set up like a trap card, kind of a play in a going first build. Skarm can search tour guide, or it can search like Lilith, Lady of Lament, which are commonly played in Infernoid decks for setting up the Void Feast trap card. So it's not awful for going first. It adds the more Void cards to your deck to try and get to Void Feast live without having to open Void Banishment to search it. So it's not awful, but it's not great. So this is definitely like the next best Void card after the first 3. I'm actually recording this particular card after the fact, and the reason is I forgot this card existed. Void Trap Hole is a normal trap card. It says when your opponent special summons a monster or monsters with 2,000 or more attack, negate the effects of those monsters with 2,000 or more attack, and if you do, destroy it. So it's just a searchable trap hole card off of the Void Banishment. It qualifies as a trap hole, so if you wanted to combine your Infernoid deck with Trap Tricks, there is an overlapping card. I don't know if this is the most sensible card to play, but it is an option. I do believe other trap holes are just better. I don't know what scenario you would actually want to play this card, but it is a additional option. Just for completeness, I wanted to include it here. And in every video, I forget to remind people to press the like button and subscribe. And yeah, we'll continue with the rest of the video. The next Void card. Void Expansion has been played to some degree of success in the past, but that was because at the time it was terraforming is in multiples, and this is a field spell. So what it allowed you to do was to use terraforming and search this card in order to have more ways of making Void Feast live. You can terraforming, search Void Expansion, then activate Void Feast, sending it to its cost to summon Infernoids. Let's talk about the actual effect of this card so you can make determinations whether or not you actually care about it. During your standby phase, you can special summon a Infernoid token, which is a Fiend Fire type level 1/0/0 token. Looks like this in the OCG if you can actually get a hold of one. If you were to special summon an Infernoid using its own summoning procedure, like banishing Infernoids from grave or your hand, you can also banish Infernoids on your field. If you're in a position where you have the field spell, Void Expansion on the field, I don't think I have a copy with me here, so I'm just going to put Void Banishment up there for now. When you summon a token, and I wanted to summon Petrula, I could summon Petrula by banishing the token. Then I could pop a back row, and then I can banish the Petrula from field to summon, like, Hermaeus. Now, that particular effect isn't particularly relevant, but it is something you can do. Your opponent cannot target Infernoid monsters you control for attacks or with effects except for the Infernoid monster with the highest level. If it's tied, then they can target either. Now, that's called the lightning rod effect. Usually you summon your Decatrons and they get kind of big sometimes. So if you like have a couple of Infernoids and then you normal a Decatron, Decatron can be the highest level monster. So it's not particularly great effect, but it's not the worst effect I've ever heard of. Next is Void Purification. This is a card I actually play quite often. I actually like this card. That's because I play Mystic Mine in my Infernoid build, so often I'll be leaving my opponent under this effect for a while, so run down what it does. So Void Purification is a continuous trap card. It says if you control a monster that's not an Infernoid, you send this card to the graveyard. That means if you control a face-down monster, or just a monster that doesn't say Infernoid in its name, this card gets sent to the graveyard. Oh, let me go back to the token for a moment. There is an official ruling in the official database that says if you were to fusion summon Infernoid Tiara using Inoku, Deviati, and the token, you can activate the effect of Tiara to send 3 cards from the extra deck to the graveyard. Even though the token technically doesn't exist in the graveyard to check its name is still Infernoid token. There's also an official ruling in the database with what I said in the previous video that if you use Sajet and 2 Decatrons, that it will not be able to use its effect because you use Decatron and Sajet. So despite that the token can't be checked what its name was in the graveyard, it still recognizes that it was used. Anyways, back to Purification. So this continuous trap card, if you control a non-Infernoid, it sends itself to the graveyard. This is a continuous like effect. It just happens in the middle of a chain. So if a long chain resolves and gives you a monster for even a second, this card will just immediately go to the graveyard. Let's see. So it has 2 effects. During your opponent's standby phase, you can target an Infernoid in your graveyard and add it to your hand. Now there is a preferable target for that. I'll get into that in a minute. And during your standby phases, you can target banished Infernoids and return them to your graveyard. So during your opponent's turn, add a banished Infernoid from your grave to your hand. During your turn, return a banished Infernoid to the graveyard. So the order in which I would recommend you doing this if you're going to play this card is obviously you want to keep Decatron in grave to add it back to your hand. And the only problem with keeping Decatron in graveyard is a new card came out since I used to play this card back in the day. It's called Ice Dragon's Prison. Now, most of the Infernoids are unaffected by Ice Dragon's Prison in the sense that they can't be special summoned from the graveyard by Ice Dragon's Prison because they must be special summoned by banishing Infernoids. The exception is Tiara and Decatron. So there is some reasons to try and keep your Decatrons banished from your graveyard, but that is a concern you might want to have. You might want to keep it in the graveyard if you play this card, but you might not want to if you don't. So depending on how you play your deck, the cards you might want to keep in your grave are Decatron to keep adding it to your hand so you have a normal summon for every turn. After that, you want to actually add your Inokus and your Deviatis back to your hand. Because in order to do the fusion summon, you need an Inoku and Deviati in your hand or deck. So if you wind up using them early and you need to make the fusion spell live, you want to try and have them accessible for the fusion. Like if they're in the graveyard, great, you can summon them, but you can't fuse. So if you manage to get both Inokus or both Deviatis into the graveyard, you might still want to try and fish them back out of the banish zone, back into your hand slowly if you do bother to play this card. Again, this card is not commonly played. It's mostly played as the next best Void card. It was out before Apocalypse, so people didn't really play it. I personally play it because I lock people under mine. After that, or if you don't need to get access to your Inoku or your Deviati, you want to start picking up the small Infernoids because they can only be summoned from your hand. When it comes to unbanishing Infernoids, that depends. Do you want to unbanish an Infernoid that you banished early because you can't access it, or do you want to unbanish an Infernoid that you want to add to your hand later? It's up to you on how you want to approach that. And it's determined by the game state. All right, next up is Voidseer. Voidseer is a quick play spell card. It used to be the most played Infernoid card before Imagination came out, before Feast came out, so people weren't really like using Void Banishment and searching things. People didn't really know how good it was. The Voidseer was like the firstly played Infernoid card. So it is a quick play spell card that you can target one Infernoid monster you control, and the target is unaffected by your opponent's card effects this turn. And it says that target. So if the monster goes from the field to the graveyard, and then it gets negated, it will be negated. So let's imagine your opponent activates a Crystal Wing and you try to negate Crystal Wing with a Decatron. Well, let's say you Voidseer or Decatron and your opponent tries to negate another card. You made your Decatron unaffected by their card effects. If you tribute the Decatron, it goes to the graveyard. Now if they negate it, it actually does get negated because as soon as it's off the field, it's now affected by their card effects. So Voidseer is kind of a weird card like that. It has a secondary effect from the graveyard. It doesn't matter what turn it was that this card made it to the graveyard. If one of your Infernoids would be destroyed by a card effect, you can banish this from grave instead. So this is one of the cards that actually allows Inoku to destroy your opponent's monsters, but not yours. But in the long run, it's a card that hasn't really made the cut in a long time to be worth playing. But it is an option you have to try and use Inoku's effect a little more proactively. There are other ways to like use a Noku without killing your own cards or get value out of killing your own cards. Like if you want to play like a Doolittle Chimera, you can summon a Noku, destroy it, and then add like a Decatron or an Ash Blossom from your graveyard to your hand. So this card's decent in specifically, I mentioned like a going first version of the Infernoid deck that does a hand loop. So this can act as like a Called by the Grave because in that version of the deck, which we'll talk about in the next episode, you actually summon Tierra on your opponent's first turn using like either Necrofusion or Super Polymerization and a card called Chain Material that lets you fusion summon using your deck. And when your Tierra comes out, Tierra is affected by like every hand trap in the game because all of the effects that it has reaches many of the different things that your opponent can hand trap, and Voidseer can just be used like a Called by the Grave. So that's like the only scenario I could see it being used now. It was useful in Masterpiece format when Anoku was the only monster big enough to attack over Masterpiece, and Masterpiece could destroy Anoku with his quick effect pop effect. So that was the time when Voidseer was useful last. It hasn't been seeing a lot of play lately because you need to make every card that makes it into your main deck count. It's a decent card. Whoops. Skipping. Alright, so the next card is Void Launch. As far as I know, there's only one player who's ever topped a regional with this card, and that was me, in a slow format, where we had 3 reasoning at the time. So this card has the same problem that Void Purification has. If you control a non-Infernoid, it gets sent to the graveyard. But during each of your standby phases, you can send 2 Infernoids from your deck to the graveyard. So back in that format, no one was killing me instantly. I had time to activate this card and just pump the Infernoids out of my deck because I didn't really want to draw those. I wanted to get into the power spells. The Vanishments and the Imaginations. A lot of those cards at the time didn't have like it was more valuable for me to not need like multiple Imaginations at the time. I just wanted to like search cards that were more productive at the time. So Launch was pretty decent. Launches are not once per turn, so Launch has the effect if you had like multiple launch and you just set them and pass and your opponent doesn't kill you, you can just send a ton of Infernoids to the graveyard. At this point in the game's history, it's a bit of an unnecessary card, but it's okay. Not awful. I don't think it would make sense to play at this point. Next card is called Eye of the Void. This is a trap card. It says special summon 1 Infernoid monster from your hand, ignoring its summoning conditions, but its effects are negated until the end of this turn. So it's just a normal trap card. No one's played this card. I think I've played it in the past, just experimenting with all the Void cards to see if they come up. There's only one scenario I've ever seen this card come up where it was productive. Well, it comes up in 2 scenarios. One, you set it and you went first and you just let your opponent do stuff. And then the next turn, you just use it to summon an extra Infernoid out of your hand. So you summon like a Tondel and Deviati, and then you go to attack your opponent, you flip this card over, and you summon like an Anoku from your hand to good game. That's one of the 2 scenarios. You can use it just to get an extra body out from a brick in your hand, but it's not really worth playing. The other time it ever came up is there were formats where people were playing Imperial Ironwall. Cards can't be banished. So I needed a way to out it in the main deck of searchable cards. So what I would do is I would Void Launch Petrula to graveyard. I would then Void Purification to add Petrula to hand, and then I would Eye of the Void to, during my opponent's end phase, summon my Petrula, and then Petrula can pop the Imperial Ironwall on the following turn because it would only be negated until the end of the turn. If that sounds convoluted, it's because it was, and that's pretty much the only real use you have for Eye of the Void, is to try and force an Infernoid onto a field in a time where you wouldn't normally be able to do so. But currently you can do most of that with Void Feast, so there's no logical reason to play this card. The next Void card is Into the Void, which is a commonly played card in spell counter decks. It's just a spell you can activate to draw a card. It says if you have 3 or more cards in your hand, you can draw a card. So that includes if this is the 3rd card in your hand. That is the official ruling on Into the Void. It says any card that says if you have 3 or more cards in your hand, if this is the 3rd card in your hand, you're allowed to activate it. And it says draw 1 card, and then during the end phase, you can discard your entire hand. It's a decent card. There aren't a lot of scenarios where you would really want to use it because people don't really want to discard their hands. And with only one of it, because it's a limited 1 card, you're not really going to need to turbo through your deck any faster to really need this card. Its best feature is that it has Void in its name, and it's a usable cost for Void Feast. And that's pretty much all the Void cards. If you have any questions specifically about the Void cards, ask them here. In the next episode, we will talk about this particular deck lists that have been played recently and strategy related to those things. If you have any questions, leave them in the comments. I'll answer whatever I can. See you guys next time.